today where we will kick off with a brief recap about MongoDB Atlas. Then we'll talk about the different stages of data lifecycle management. After this, we will introduce about Online Archive and its features. We'll dive deep and talk about configuring Online Archive and some of the best practices. We will talk about the new features of Online Archive, including managing query limits, and then the new and improved Online Archive, following which we'll be talking about some more features that we introduced with Online Archive that includes improved metrics and telemetry. And then we'll cap it off by sharing some benefits and customer story and giving enough time for the Q&A. And with that said, let us start with a recap about MongoDB Atlas. MongoDB Atlas is a developer data platform that we all know. It's the most advanced cloud database service on the market with its unmatched data distribution and mobility across all cloud platforms. It has built-in automation capabilities for resource and workload optimization and so much more. It hosts a ton of features that you're already aware, where it intelligently automates critical operations to make sure your data is secure and your database is running as expected. Data stored in the Atlas is instantly available to be used with the rest of the platform, from full text search to analytics to visualizations. In addition, we offer advanced performance optimization tools, so you always have the database resources you need to keep building. Why should you invest in MongoDB Atlas? Because with MongoDB's intuitive data model and query APIs, MongoDB Atlas gives engineering organizations the versatility they need to build sophisticated applications that can adapt to changing customer demands and market trends. Not only is Atlas a multi-cloud document database available, it also delivers the most advanced security and data distribution capabilities of any fully managed service. So you can get started in minutes, and you can leverage intelligent automation to maintain performance at scale as your applications evolve over time. So we focus on consistently shipping exceptional features and products with the most intelligent performance optimization tools. We reduce complexity across systems with a simplified data architecture and API. We scale your teams confidently with Atlas best-in-class infrastructure operations. And also we run anywhere in the world with MongoDB Atlas multi-cloud reach. And here, as you can see, that we've invested as much, if not more, in building out our cloud capabilities alongside continuous innovation on our code database software. So, of course, we've got a whole bunch of features. We've got rich querying capabilities, sharding and replication, client-side, fee-level encryption, just to name a few. And there's a lot more with MongoDB Atlas. Now, let us get into a little bit about understanding the data lifecycle management, and more specifically about Online Archive, which the webinar is about. There are 5 stages of data lifecycle management. To put it broadly, it starts with the creation of data, where the data entry is created, and then data is acquired from different kinds of sources. Once the data is created, data has to be stored, and for data to be stored, it requires the required security and backup measures. Data then gets utilized, data is viewed and processed, while the modifications are required as well. So the first 3 stages deals with the creation, storage, and usage. Then we move on to the archival process, where data, once it's being used and once it's already used, it moves to a cold storage tier for data tiering purposes, but it needs to be archived and protected and available for use at a later stage. And that particular stage is called the archival. And after the archival process, and once data remains in the archival stage for a period of time, data gets expired from the archive itself, and data gets purged from the archiving area or the cold tier. So we'll talk about these stages, especially the archival stage and the expiration stage, Within MongoDB Atlas, it is dealt with the product called as Online Archive, which you're also familiar about. So introducing Online Archive, as you know, that Online Archive is automatically, it archives data from the MongoDB Atlas clusters to fully manage cloud object storage. And with MongoDB Online Archive, you can not only tier your data to cloud object storage, at the same time, you can access your data while optimizing on your cost and performance as your data grows in MongoDB Atlas. So you can move your cold data to fully manage cloud object storage by MongoDB. It's completely automated, and at the same time, you have access to your cold data. The key features of MongoDB Atlas begins with automated data tiering. So from a data tiering perspective, you can set in very simple rules with MongoDB Online Archive, where you can archive age data to cheaper storage to ensure that your costs are optimized, and at the same time, you have access to the data as and when required. We give you the ability to query your archives as well, and your data can be queried from your archive. And also, we give you the ability to federate your queries through your archive and cluster and combine the results and get the combined results effectively from both of these places, both from your hot tier, which is your Atlas cluster, and also your cold tier, which is the Online Archive. And it is fully managed, which means that there's no need for the users to configure separate cloud object storage. We completely do it from our side. It is fully automated. It's easy to use. You can create, update, and pause archival rules using the Atlas UI or the APIs. Here you can see a schematic representation of how Online Archive works. Online Archive works either based on a date-based rule or a custom archival rule, which means that you can select the number of days after which the data gets archived from your Atlas cluster to Online Archive, and you can select a date-based rule. Anything older than a specific number of days gets moved from the Atlas cluster to Online Archive, or you can provide a custom archival rule. You can type in your own condition where it has to be met before data gets moved from the cluster to the cold tier. And once the data is offloaded to fully manage object storage, which is Online Archive, you can query all of your data using a single endpoint. So if there's a query that goes against both of these places, there is a federated connection string, which gives you the ability to pull data not only from the cluster and Online Archive, it'll combine the results together, and it'll provide you results using this federated connection string. We'll get into the connection strings, and I'll talk about how you can connect to the archive and also using the federated connections string of the cluster and Online Archive in a bit. But this is an overview about how you can connect using Online Archive and then query using Online Archive when the data is needed to be queried. Now we'll go through a step-by-step process of how to create Online Archive. It's a simple set of sequence of steps that the users can easily go ahead and set it up if they have their data in the Atlas clusters, and if there's a need to archive data using MongoDB Online Archive. So configuring archive, this is a first place where the user can go in and create an Online Archive. There's a tab called as Online Archive. Once you get into your cluster, you have your cluster, and you can see different tabs. There's overview, there's metrics and collections, which you so widely use, and there's the Online Archive tab. So choose this specific Online Archive tab from your cluster, and then you can say configure Online Archive to get started. Once you click on configure Online Archive, the first page describes about some of the best practices of how to create and configure the archive. And it is important to pay close attention to the steps on this overview tab, And that is because it is important to set up your archive correctly for optimal performance of your online archive while querying it. So you can pause or delete the online archive at any point in time. But it's important to know that online archive cannot be updated and individual documents cannot be deleted. Since online archive is read-only, the documents cannot be updated. It's important to also configure online archive correctly to ensure that while querying your online archive, it is best optimized for your query performance. The very first step, once you go through the best practices, you move on to the next page. And this is where the online archive, you provide an information about from which namespace you want your online archive to get created. So you have the database and the collection name that would have to be provided at the start, which is the namespace. And then there's a storage region. This is the place where your entire data within the online archive will be hosted. And this can be a different region from that of the cluster. But by default, from the dropdown, we provide the closest region or the same region as that of the cluster where online archive can be stored. So that's the default value that we provide. But we do not mandate that you select only that region. You can pick and choose from all of our supported regions from the dropdown. And the ones that are marked, the one that is marked the closest will be marked as with a star that you can see over here on your screen. But it is important to note that once you designate a storage region, you will not be able to change the storage region. So it's important to pick and choose the storage region correctly. And also to note that even if your cluster region changes, or if the storage region of your cluster changes in the future, your online archive storage region will remain the same. From the next set of steps, you can see that there's a date match criteria, or there's a custom criteria, which means that you can move online archive based on a date rule. In this particular example, we say after how many days data gets moved from Atlas to online archive, from your cluster to online archive. In this case, it is 34 days, which means that anything older than 34 days and anything older than 34 days specified by the date field that we have. In my case, I have something called as example date field. In your case, it can be any field from your collection. And the data that is more than 34 days based on a certain format gets moved to online archive. If you have a custom criteria based on a condition, you can go to custom criteria and set something up. Depending on if the condition is satisfied, then the data gets moved to online archive. The next step is where we provide details about the scheduled archiving window. And this is an optional setting, but it's important to note that if a scheduled archiving window is not created, then the data gets archived continuously. It keeps archiving every 5 minutes. Although if the condition for the archiving is not met, the archiving time period between the runs will expand. It'll start with 5 minutes every archival runs. It can expand to 10 minutes, and it goes all the way up to 4 hours if the condition for archiving is not met. But we highly encourage that you do schedule our archives, because archiving will eventually move data from your cluster and it moves to the archive. It's a heavy operation that needs quite a bit of resources. So it's best that you schedule it during a time window where you can archive and then move the data accordingly within that time window. So we see that most users, they run their archives during off-peak hours. That is, they run during weekdays, during midnights, or any other time, so that it does not affect their main schedules. And also note that if you're scheduling a time window between 12 a.m. to 6 a.m., as it's mentioned over here, the archiving does not abruptly stop at the indicated time. The archiving can extend beyond 6 a.m. It depends on the last job that is running. So if the last job were to run at 5:55 a.m. and it runs for 10 minutes, then the archiving continues till 6:05 a.m. So the last job will continue running, and we do not abruptly end at 6 a.m. or we do not fail the jobs. The archiving will continue to run, but it will run maybe a few minutes after 6 a.m. The next part of the step is to select the partition fields. And it is important that the partition fields are configured correctly. Now, partition fields are what's called as the commonly queried fields from online archive. Once you create your online archive, it is important to note that the partition fields cannot be changed. The partition fields are completely frozen. So in this case, I have an example date field, I have field A and field B, and I cannot change this once I create the online archive. I cannot change the partition fields. And it's important to note that the most queried field will be preferred to be there at the first layer of partitioning, which means that I have an example date field, field A and field B, and I'm going with my assumption that example date field, I'm always going to be querying based on the date field. Hence, I'm having date field as the top of my partition. It is at position number 1. Then I move on to the second and the third field. Note that for a date-based rule, the date field is automatically selected as a partition field. And if you do not want your date as a partition field, if you're not going to be querying as often with your date field, you can select the move down option right next to the archive date field. So that way it moves down or it will lesser your priority of your date field, while field A and field B can be pushed on top. For a custom criteria, however, that there are a maximum of 2 fields that can be selected, or your 2 most commonly queried fields for your online archive. If it's a date-based criteria, then we allow you to select 3 partition fields, including the date field that we see over here on the screen. Some of the do's and don'ts with respect to selecting the partitioning strategies. The do's is that choose your most frequently queried fields as your partition fields. This cannot be stressed enough, because once the archive is created, you cannot go and edit your partitions. You cannot go and edit and say, I need to point to something else. So it's important to select your most queried fields. If you're going to be only querying on, let's say, a name and an age, you want to only have name and age as your partition fields. You do not want to pick something else. And it's important to check the order of the partitioning fields. As much as the most commonly queried fields are being set up, the order is also extremely important, because if you are querying more on the date field, you would have date field as the first in order. If date field is the least queried field, then you would want to move down and rather have field A or field B at the top, because it's important for the ordering to be exactly correct. So these are the do's. And the don'ts is we suggest not to add irrelevant fields as partitions, especially if you're not going to be querying something, because in the backend, we manage storage of our online archive in such a way that depends completely on your partition fields. So if you're not going to be querying it, it would best to not have those fields as partitions. If you're just querying just based on the date field, you need not feel that you'll have to fill in fields 2 and 3. You can just leave them as blank. As you see here, that the second field and the third field are completely optional. So if you're only querying your archive based on a date, you can just have the date, and you can just leave fields 2 and 3 are blank. And finally, don't ignore the move down option for date fields. By default, the date field is going to be the first field that is specified. But if your date is not queried often, you have to move it down, because it's important to pick and choose the most relevant field as your partition field and number 1 in the list. So do not ignore the moved on option, especially if it suits your use case. Finally, before doing it, before selecting and confirming and beginning archiving, you can check whether all your information that you've entered there, be it your namespace, your storage region, your archive field and age limit, and there's something called as a deletion age limit. Deletion age limit is 365 days, which means that data gets deleted from the archive after 365 days. This is completely an optional field. This is not a mandatory field. It is set up depending on your use case, and if you want data to be deleted from your archive directly, so you can even review this as well. Note that namespace, storage region, and age limits, these are all mandated fields, including partitioning fields, while the deletion age limit and your archiving window, these are completely optional. So depending on your use case, you can either set it up or just leave it as blank, and ensure that your partitioning fields exactly in this order. I see that there's a date field, then I have a field A and field B, and I ensure that the exact ordering is correct. And once the partition fields are ordered correctly and the storage region and everything is fine, then you can go ahead and begin archiving. For connecting to the archive, notice that we provide 3 connection strings. Of course, there's one connection string in the middle which says connect to the cluster, but there are 2 other connection strings that we provide. Either you can connect to your online archive directly, which means that you only go to the archive and then you only pull in data from the archive. But also we give you a federated connection string, which goes both to the cluster and online archive. So let us consider this use case that you are setting your archival rule to after 100 days or approximately 3 months. Okay, so if you need data which is older than 100 days, let's say you need data which is from a year or even 2 years down the line, then you can use your online archive only connection string. With that connection string, you're just going into the archive and fetch the data from the archive. But let's say that you need data from both places. You need data anywhere from 90 to 110 days, which means it's going to your cluster between days 90 to 100, and then it's going to the archive from days 100 to 110. So in this case, you can use the first connection string, which would federate against both your cluster and online archive, and it's going to pull results from both your cluster and online archive together. And it's very important to note that by default, the connection string that you have available is connect to cluster and online archive. It's important to note that only if you need a federated connection string, then we recommend that you choose that connection string. However, you're going to be querying often from the archive and you're querying often from the cold storage, then you can use the online archive only connection string. This would ensure that you do not federate from both places unless required. We'll talk about some of the new features that we introduced this year, starting with managing your query limits. Now, managing these querying limits is something that we introduced because online archive is consumption-based pricing, which means that if you are not querying your archive often, then we will not bill you for the queries because you do not have any queries executed on the archive. But at the same time, it might be important to manage your costs for your online archives. So this can be done by clicking on the Data Federation tab that you see on the left part of your screen. This will open up a page where you see there's a tab called as Manage Query Limits. And this Manage Query Limits, it affects the data processing costs very specifically, and not so much as data retrieval or transfer or even storage. But the processing cost is where the data is being processed and data is being fetched to give you your respective results. So to manage this, you can select the Manage Querying Limits. And once you click on this little tab that you see on the right side of the window, it says Manage Query Limits. It takes you to this page where by default, we have a 100 terabyte limit for online archive, which means that if there is excessive querying that happens, the queries, there's a cap limit of 100 terabytes. So after a few thousand queries, that might result to 100 terabytes. It wouldn't give you the option to query any further because this is the default limit. Of course, this default limit can be changed, and you can go ahead and edit this at any point in time so that you know exactly how much has to be queried. In that sense, you can control how much your billing pertaining to online archive amounts to on a monthly basis. If you need to go and set a limit, you can obviously set a limit for a project or an instance, and you can not only limit the amount of data in terms of on a daily basis, on a weekly or monthly basis, but also on a querying basis. So this way, you're ensuring that you're not doing complete collection scans of your archive. Your archive sizes can be huge. It can be terabytes, tens of terabytes, or even hundreds of terabytes. So you want to ensure that your querying limits are there and added appropriately so that you do not encounter some kind of billing spikes, especially if you're querying your archive, which might be quite unnecessary depending on your use case. So you can go ahead and add these querying limits, and these can be added for a project or for an instance. And it's very easy to do that. And at the same time, you can go ahead and edit these querying limits at a later stage so that if there's a change needed and if you need to query often more, you can go and adjust this at any point in time. And there's also the option to terminate the queries, which means the queries are terminated immediately once the limit has been reached. Of course, if you're not going to select that option, then we do not terminate the queries, we just let the queries run. Now we are going to talk about MongoDB's new online archive, which uses a new storage service that will enhance the querying performance. This is a feature that we introduced a few months before, and it's extremely beneficial to the customers. And we're just going to dive deep into how online archives, a new feature, will benefit you for your different use cases. So with the new online archives, we improve your querying performance. So we have an enhanced storage service, which has rich metadata that is completely optimized, which will help you to fetch your data in targeted and fewer partition scans. So you don't have to wait a longer time just to fetch your data from the archive. We have analytical storage, which will improve the performance of the queries that you typically run, which can include either pointed queries, find some data which is very specific to a point in time, or it can even be range-based queries where find data between a couple of dates in a time range between certain dates, and you pull in data from this specific date range. So Online Archive is designed right now to improve the performance for these types of queries and more. We also have the auto rebalancing and sorting techniques, which will ensure that as your data is growing within the Online Archive, your performance is still very good, especially when there's a lot of data in the archive. It might be needed to fetch the data back within a reasonable amount of time. So we have ensured that our storage service is completely optimized. Not only is it optimized for querying performance, because of the targeted and fewer partition scans, it'll also reduce your overall cost because the data scan behind the scenes is significantly less. It is still important to know that you have to set your partition fields correctly, because if you do not set your partition fields correctly and you're querying completely on a non-partition field, it will still be a complete collection scan. So that's where the configuration of Online Archive is extremely important. So you set it up in a right way. And once it's set up in the right way, we have drastically improved the performance. And while querying the archive, the costs are considerably lower as well. And also note that we have storage in the same region as compute, which means that there are no data transfer is not required between the storage and compute tiers. Once you pick and choose a storage region, we even process the data in the same region, especially when you're issuing a query against your online archive. So overall, we improved the query performance and ensured that your costs are significantly reduced when it comes to online archives querying. We also added some improved metrics and telemetry, which I'm going to be talking to you about, starting with the fact that you can see a little bit of a dashboard once you create your online archive. So in this specific case, I have a particular archive where I have 1.4 terabytes of total data archived. I see that my archive field is a start time field, and I have an age limit of 90 days, which means that anything more than 90 days will be archived from my Atlas cluster to my online archive. I do not have any date deletion limit, which means that data will not be deleted from the archive. It'll be marked as not applicable. One thing to note is that this dashboard that you're seeing is applicable for new online archives. So beginning June of this year is where you can see this dashboard for the newly created archives. Existing archives, which are the old archives, will not have the total data archived, or it will not have the total document size as well, the total number of documents as well, because those are older archives, and eventually we are going to be migrating the older archives through our backend mechanisms to the new storage service. The older archives will be marked as not applicable. So instead of 1.48 terabytes, if you have an older archive that was created last year or the year before, it's going to be shown as not applicable. But eventually, once we migrate over all of your older archives, which we will be doing completely from MongoDB side, you will still see the total data archived and the other details. In addition to the statistics, you can also see the partition fields here. You can see the min date field and the max date field. So you're going to see a date range within the archive, which means that I have my archival data from 2021 of February to 2022 of September. So I can see this date range here. You know exactly the date range within your archive, what it constitutes, how much data is there. And if I go on to the next page, if I hover on the total data size, I will also see the number of documents in the archive. So this is the estimated documents that are present in the archive. In addition to it, I can hover on the last archival run. I see the last few archival runs. I see the time it ran and how much of data was archived during each archival run. So this is very helpful in understanding how and when data is getting archived, and how much of data is being archived during the last few archival runs. So these are important operational statistics with respect to online archive that is very helpful for you. So also note that some of the future improvements are something that you're going to also see the next archival run. And that is something which we are going to be introducing in the future, where in addition to the past or archival runs, you can also see the next archival run. So you know exactly when your next archival run will take place. Of course, if you have set a specific time window of archiving, then the archiving only happens within the time window. If you have not set up a time window, then the archiving happens 24 hours, but with an interval of 5 minutes that I mentioned in the previous slide. Happy to be sharing some of the benefits and the customer story of Online Archive here. So starting with why it is good for developers. From a developer perspective, it's very easy for automated tiering purposes, especially to move your cold data to Online Archive and eliminate the manual data migration process, which can be a bit tedious. As you've seen before in the presentation, it just takes a few clicks to create Online Archive, and it's completely automated, and you can schedule windows and you can schedule configurations very quickly instead of writing complicated scripts and then moving data manually. It's also easily queryable, which means that you're not only querying data from the archive, which is cold tier, you can combine data from your cold tier and your cluster together using that federated connection endpoint. And so data is combined, it gives you your hot data and cold data together, depending on your use case. And it's fully managed because there's no need to have a separate configuration in Cloud Object Storage and do all the backend work behind the scenes. We manage it for you. It's completely managed, and we automate the entire process behind the scenes. That is moving data from your Atlas cluster and moving data to cold storage, which is online archive. We completely manage the process end-to-end for you. From a business perspective, automated tiering would save significantly on costs, especially if you're having cold data that you're not querying as often in your cluster sitting over there. Instead of that, you would want to move to cost-efficient storage and increase productivity. So not only is data just sitting there in the archive, we'll give you the ability to query from the archive, which means that you can combine data in real time for faster insights. You can combine data from your hot and cold tiers as well using the federated connection string. And it's fully managed, and this means that you wouldn't have to manage anything, especially when it's something to do with moving data constantly or maintaining data in your cold storage. So we manage it for you. It's just a few simple clicks of configuring the rules and then setting up your online archive. Finally, we will look at why do we think the archival, this is a customer story that we'd like to share. From a savings perspective, it is quite significant because this is one of our customers from Nesto Software. They didn't mention that they were able to save significantly when it's relating to data storage costs and cloud backup costs. So this is just by a few clicks of online archive, and their overall database spend was reduced significantly. And these are some of the common patterns and observations which we receive and the positive feedback we receive from our customers, especially when selecting online archive, which may be very pertinent to their use cases. So just by a few clicks, you might be able to save significant amount of money on your data storage or your cloud backup costs and your overall Atlas database spend as well by configuring online archive, and then we do the maintenance for you. So with that said, I would like to open the floor for any questions. But before that, I'd like to pass it over to either Sabina or Nia to talk about MongoDB local, which might be at some place which is closer to you. So you can learn more about MongoDB products. If they'd like to tell more about MongoDB.local, they can mention this. Over to you, Sabina and Nia.
Yes, thank you, Prem, for your presentation. Before we get into the Q&A section, we're going to drop the poll. So please make sure you answer the poll questions and share your feedback with us today on how you thought the presentation went. And while you're answering the poll questions, I want to invite you to attend one of our .local events, which might be coming to a city near you. The next events will be in Boston, Dallas, and Atlanta. When you attend, you will have the chance to meet with peers from this webinar with you, like Prem or Sabina, who is answering your questions in the Q&A section. Make sure to visit mongodb.com/local to learn more. When you register, enter code webinar50 to save 50%. And while you are doing that and registering for .local and answering the poll questions, I will hand it off to Prem and Sabina to answer the questions within the Q&A section.
Happy to answer some of the questions that we have. So one of the questions was, can a federated string be used if a private endpoint on a private endpoint connection string? Yes, absolutely. So private endpoint is a separate setting for MongoDB Online Archive. And if you're using private endpoint, you can still be using your federated connection strings. There is another question that talks about can you change your archival rule? Yes, you can change your archival rule at any point in time. So if you have a date-based rule, you can go and modify it at any point in time, where if you have set it up for something like 100 days and then you'd want to change it, you can do it. But what you cannot change is like a partition field. Partition field are your most commonly queried fields. That cannot be changed. But your rules that you have set it up for your archive, those can be changed. Feel free to ask any questions on the Q&A or in the chat section, and then we can answer. Okay, there's a question on the chat which says, does Online Archive work the same way on all versions and all cluster tiers? Yes, it works on the same way on all version and on cluster tiers, but it depends on when your Online Archive was created. We have the older online archives that were created before June of this year, which will not have some of the performance optimizations that were mentioned before, and some of the metrics and telemetry. That is because only the new archives created after a cutoff date, which is June 7th to be precise. So any online archive created after that will have these performance improvements, will have the metrics and other details that you can see. But eventually, over the next several months, we will be migrating your older created archives to the new storage service. We'll be doing this completely in the backend, so you do not have to do anything from your side. And we will be moving data. And once that happens, all online archives will behave in the exact same way.
Prem, please go to the next slide. Thank you.
If there's any more questions, Sabina, you can direct it to me, either from the chat or you can type in your question in Q&A.
Please, everyone, continue to fill out the poll while Sabina will ask Prem a question, and she'll also drop the question in a webinar chat so you guys can remember the question that is being asked.
Okay, so there's another question. If you have a free version of Atlas, can you test Online Archive? Yeah, Online Archive is available for M10 and above clusters. So this is something, not on the free version. For M10 and above is something where you can go ahead and create Online Archive. There's another question that says, can you have multiple rules on the same collection? Well, you can only have an online archive on a specific namespace. So if there are multiple online archives on the same namespace, only one online archive can be active. Others will they'll have to be inactive, which means they'll have to be paused or they have to be deleted. So online archive is essentially moving data from your collection and it moves to cold tier. So even if there are multiple rules, well, you can have multiple rules, but only one of them will be active.
Okay, we'll give it a couple of more minutes. If we have no questions from the host and no questions from the attendees today, we thank you all for joining, but we'll still give it a couple of minutes and keep it open since we do have some more time. We would love your questions. Sabina or Prem, if you have any other information to add to the presentation from today that will be helpful to the attendees, please share. Yes, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared this Friday. So please stay tuned for an email with the recording and any other information to help continue your MongoDB journey.
Prem, there are a couple other questions in the chat.
Yeah, I can take another question on how does MongoDB delete the documents. Yeah, how we do that is, this is behind the scenes. We have a job where we move data in bulk, and we would do in increments of 2 gigabytes, which means that a job can at the maximum take in 2 gigabytes amount of data at every single archival run. And once that is done, it takes the documents and it goes and inserts into the archive together. And once the documents are present in the online archive, those documents are deleted back from the cluster. So that way you just have a single copy of the data, but it is moved from one place to another. And it's in increments of 2 gigabytes. There's another question, which is about if the date is based upon date is within a field of data when the data was created. No, it's based on a field within your collection, which means that you have a specific collection. It's not based on the creation date of your data within Atlas. It is very specific to very specific to a field that you select, and that field would have to be configured by you at the time of archival. There's another question about encryption at rest. Well, as far as encryption at rest is concerned, like we provide encryption at rest, but with MongoDB managed keys. If you're very specifically asking for your own keys that you'd like to manage, that is something which we would be doing. It's on our roadmap sometime in the future. So that is something that we'll be adding in the future. There's another question that talks about what happens to the data if MongoDB cluster becomes unhealthy when it's archiving. I'm not sure if you're referring to the clusters and the load capacity on the cluster. So that is something would have to be managed by you using the scheduled window that we have, which means that within a specific time window, there is the data that is being moved. But of course, if there are other important activities which are going on in the cluster, you would not want to be scheduling your archive at that time to ensure that there's no resource contention or the queries on the database itself is getting affected. So you do not want to schedule at a time where it is where there's a lot of activity going on.
Okay, we'll keep it open just a few more minutes longer. Please send your questions in, and thank you everyone for answering the poll. This webinar recording will be shared via email on Friday. And don't forget to sign up for our .local events that will be happening in Boston, Dallas, and Atlanta, if that is a city near you. But please keep track on our mongodb.com/local to see if there is an event near you with experts on these webinars. Also, if you have any other questions outside of this topic, please ask the questions in our MongoDB community forums. Check the check the chat for the link. And Sabina also dropped a resource to learn more about Online Archive. This resource will also be included via email, but please take a look ahead of time if you have any questions. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Prem, for a wonderful presentation, and Sabina for answering the questions, and Prem as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much on behalf of Nia, Sabina, and myself, Prem. Have a great day ahead. And if anything, if you need any more questions, then feel free to reach out using our community forums that were shared before, and also learn more about Online Archive using the links shared as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.